Hello everyone and welcome. Our payloads in this series just keep getting bigger, and that's necessitating taking our lifter design to the next level. And that's what we're going to be looking at in this episode. We're going to be adjusting our launch profile, this time adjusting thrust during our ascent to get more out of our engines, and we're also going to be taking a look at adapting our lifter design, in particular the upper stages, to be able to lift the heaviest payloads that we can with the engines that we got. We're also going to take a moment to look at a new part that I've unlocked and how we can add Separatrons to our discarded stages to help them separate more cleanly. But first, what is the motivation for all these large payloads? So right here we have the Apollo 11A. This was a lander I used a couple of episodes ago to land down on the lunar surface, come back up, but it hooked up with a command vessel which took our Kerbals home, leaving this guy perfectly functional lander, but low on fuel, just sitting here in orbit. Certainly would be nice to hook something up to it. And I was thinking, oh, a station would be absolutely awesome to hook up to it. And that would involve obviously some rendezvous. And then I realized, well, that's not the only thing I have to rendezvous with, because here in lunar orbit I have a Genwin's capsule. It is in need of a bit. It's a bit of an inclined orbit here. Certainly would be nice if we could rescue Genwin. And Genwin's not the only one, because if I go to here in Kerbin's orbit, in this rather inclined large orbit, I have Mitsted's rescue. They're in need of a rescue as well. And so I thought I need an episode that's all about rendezvousing, and that's going to be next episode. Because this episode, I ended up building a couple of new crafts. One of them here is the Apollo 12. I'll be completely frank, this is really just the command vessel that was used for the Apollo 11A, and then I slapped a brand new booster underneath it, which is actually in fact a slimmed down version of the lifter that put up all my Apollos a couple of episodes ago. All I did was slim down the radial boosters on it. This does have a new feature built on it though. It does have Separatrons, so why don't we talk a little bit about Separatrons. Other than that, it has the exact same principles behind it in all of our other builds. So Separatrons, just why don't I show it to you in here. They're under engines, they are right here. It's the Sepratron 1, and we'll stick one here so we can take a look at it. So zoom on in on there. There is a Sepratron. It is a very small solid rocket booster. Only has, where are they here? Has in a vacuum 18 kilonewtons of thrust, so quite a lot of thrust for given its size, and a small amount of solid rocket fuel in there. So once you fire, like all the other SRBs, once you fire it off, it's off. Its purpose really is to be used to separate large stages. And you can use these in a variety of different ways. I'll leave it up to your imagination, but I have them tucked in here. There's two of them, right? One there and one on the opposite side, and then one here and one on the opposite side. And everybody has their own little strategy on how to place these. I place them, you can see, centered on this, and then also pointing somewhat downwards, and then I use the move tool to recess them a little bit into the booster. What I also do is I take out, when I use them for this purpose, most of the solid propellant, because all it needs is that quick kick to push the booster away, and that helps them separate a little bit more cleanly. If you get yourself into larger boosters like this booster that's meant to lift up my Mun Station, which is all hidden under there, you'll be seeing that in all its glorious details in a little while. But when I get larger boosters, like for instance these guys built out of 2.5 meter parts, sometimes one Sepratron's not enough, so these ones have two Separatrons, one on each side. I tend to put them a little bit higher than where the decoupler is, because the decoupler itself also pushes on the booster, and the idea is to get the booster to peel back, get the nose of the booster to peel back a little bit more, and then once the nose is angled away from the main rocket, aerodynamics tends to take care of the rest and kind of push these things away so that they can separate more cleanly. As for the station, it can house 5 Kerbals because that was a contract requirement. I also made sure to put on enough fuel that it can refuel that lander 4 times over. It also has 3 docking berths, so lots of opportunity to expand on it in the future if I want to. And I'm also going to use the inventory system that's built into 1.11 to put in a ton of equipment that I recently unlocked so that I can upgrade that lander, get it to be everything that it can be. And as always, the craft files are down there in the description if you want to download this and play with it yourself. But this is not going to be about stations. We're going to talk about that next episode. This episode is about building boosters. And speaking of this rocket, at a hefty 177.9 tons, this is easily the largest rocket I've built so far. In fact, it necessitated finally upgrading that launch pad to its highest tier, tier 3, in order for the launch pad to be able to stand the weight of this thing. But again, it's still built on all the same principles that we have already talked about. The wonderful things about rockets is that as you get larger and larger parts, at least the rockets in KSP scale up very nicely. They don't get more difficult to build, they just get bigger and more glorious. But what I really want to talk about is about launch efficiency. I've talked about getting into orbit before, and I gave what I thought was the simplest and cleanest way to get into orbit in a reasonable way. But now what I want to talk about is how you can get yourself into orbit more efficiently. But let's start by taking out one of my older rockets. This is the Kuryus that I used to do my first rendezvous video. What I want to just draw attention to right now is it's on the vacuum. It has a total of 3,929 meters per second of thrust. Now let's make sure this thing is loaded up with Kerbals. It certainly is. And let's launch this. We're going to start this off in exactly the same way as we've done this in the past. We're going to put SAS on, throttle up. I'm going to go over here and put on our orbital data because I do want to keep an eye on apoapsis, and then we're simply going to punch it. And I like to go straight up until I get to a speed of about 50 meters per second, at which point we're going to pitch about 5 degrees or so towards the east. There we go, hitting it towards the east. Trying to keep that heading at around 90. Let's lock that onto the prograde vector. I can see that my heading's a little bit too low. It's towards the north, so I need to kind of pull that up. Always have to do a little bit of adjusting here towards the beginning. Let's let that settle back onto the prograde vector. But when you make these adjustments, make sure they're not that large. Stay close to that prograde vector. I don't like to deviate outside of this little circle. That's looking pretty good. Maybe and if you feel like you're falling over too quickly, you can just lock this on to SL. Stage those. Put that back on prograde again. I like to hit a pitch of about 45 degrees at an altitude of about 10 kilometers. Again, probably a little bit, so I'm going to stop that. Lock. Now we'll lock it back on the prograde again. But don't get too finicky with this. Don't fiddle about with it too much. But we're now at a heading of 90 degrees, and we're just going to keep this locked on the prograde vector. My hands have left the keyboard, and all I got to do now is keep an eye on my apoapsis and keep an eye on my staging course. And when we get to an apoapsis of 80 kilometers, I'm going to cut our throttle. And the reason why I'm doing this with an old rocket is because after we do this launch, I'm going to launch again with a slightly adjusted launch profile and show you how it is a little bit more efficient. With the new rockets that we are just looking at, that change in profile has already been incorporated into the designs of the rocket themselves, so I can't use them as a fair comparison. Apoapsis at 70. 80 kilometers, cut that throttle. Okay. If you have fairings on there, leave them on there for now. Once your throttle has been cut, actually having the extra mass, and of course the fairing does improve the aerodynamic qualities of it, but extra mass and improved aerodynamics help you get through the atmosphere more efficiently. So if you've cut thrust, leave that fairing on until you're pretty much outside of the atmosphere. And we're going to put this right down on the horizontal, heading still at 90 degrees. We're watching our time to apoapsis. We do not want that time to get down to 0. And while we're looking at that, take a look at periapsis and notice the number, negative 420 kilometers. I'm going to draw attention to this again when we get to our next launch, but right now we're getting close to about 30 seconds to apoapsis, so we're going to throttle up. And you don't want that time to apoapsis to get down to 0, at least not until you're very close to finishing off your burn. So you adjust your throttle to keep that decreasing, but again, if it starts to decrease, get too close to 0, increase that throttle back up again. 80, went a little bit too far. That's okay. So 81 by 87. But let's take a look at how much delta V we have left. We have 419 meters per second of delta V left, which means that this ascent cost us 3,510 meters per second. Let's then try this again. So we're going to revert flight back to launch. We're going to do this slightly differently. The first part of this, though, is exactly the same. Again, get to about 50 meters per second, at which point we're going to be knocking it a little bit, about 5 degrees or so towards the east. Locking that onto the prograde vector, trying to minimize my adjustments. And now that we got this going on an ascent, I'm not doing any more adjustments anymore, 90 degrees, we're locked onto the prograde vector. Now what I want to draw attention to is not just our apoapsis, but our time to apoapsis. Notice how that time to apoapsis is continuing to build. What I'm going to do is keep everything locked on prograde the way I am right now, but as we get close to a minute, I'm going to start throttling down. I want to keep that time to apoapsis below a minute. I like to keep it above about 45 seconds or so, but definitely below a minute. And what you'll be finding yourself doing as I continue to reduce throttle is, because this thing is, if you keep the throttle the same, the thrust stays the same, but the mass is continually decreasing because we're losing fuel. So it's going to continue to accelerate at a higher and higher rate. So you're going to find yourself continually reducing that throttle as it makes its way up. Staging, so we'll do that. Now when you stage, your throttle profile might change, so be ready for that. I got to throttle up. We're only on one engine now. Oh, time to apoapsis is going up, so we throttle down. We throttle down a little bit more. And this is going to take you longer to get there. No doubt about it, but I think when we get to the end, you'll find it worth it. And the thing I want to draw attention to is, not only is our apoapsis increasing, but look at our periapsis increasing. That's kind of the key to why this is more efficient. One thing as well is, now that we're under thrust, you want to get rid of this fairing earlier. We just cracked 50 kilometers. That's a good time to do it. There we go. Because now that fairing is simply extra mass. Ooh, let's decrease thrust even further. We just cracked a minute on the apoapsis, time to apoapsis. Now the fairing is just extra mass. You don't want to be carrying the extra mass while you're under thrust, and we're so high in the atmosphere that atmospheric drag is getting pretty negligible. And you're going to get yourself to a point where you get tired of reducing the thrust. You're going to get just impatient and want to get this over with. If you're anything like me anyway, that's going to happen to you. My thrust is pretty low, and my time to apoapsis is really starting to build. But you know what? I'm at a point now where I really just don't care. I don't want to reduce my thrust any further than I already have. So I'm just going to let this build. I'm going to let my apoapsis build as well. And we're just gonna, I'm not touching anything anymore. I'm just gonna wait until my apoapsis hits 80 kilometers, and then we're gonna cut it. And boom, 80 kilometers right there. And what I want to draw attention to, I mean, these numbers are still falling because we are a little bit still in the atmosphere, but look at that periapsis. It is about 43 kilometers. Let's time warp out of the atmosphere. We're about 30 seconds from apoapsis, and this time, because we have very little thrust to add, look at our velocity. Our velocity is almost up to a perfect orbit. Like if we take a look here, look how close we are to an orbit already. So we just are going to wait till we're like a few seconds away from apoapsis. There we go. Add a bit of thrust. Hardly any. And actually, just to make it fair, we'll put this up to 87 like I did before. So we can really compare our orbit. So there's our orbit. And now we can take a look at how much we got left. It's 447 meters per second left. That means that this ascent cost 3,482 meters per second. which is only 28 meters per second less than the first time where we went full thrust the whole way. So you might not be thinking this is too big a deal, but it allows us to change the design of our vessels, which can make a very big difference. If I take a look at this one, again, put it on vacuum delta V, and take a look at the thrust to weight ratios of the various stages, I was suggesting to people early on, and again, for doing a very quick ascent and an easy ascent, that's definitely the right advice, is to have continually building TWRs. So here the TWR starts at 1.65 in a vacuum, then 2, then 2.04. But what I want to do is pull out my most recent rocket and compare its thrust to weight ratios of these 3 stages. And in particular, what I want to do is look at the very, very top stage. Because at the very, very top, you don't need very much thrust at all. That means that you can get away with smaller engines than you otherwise would have put on there. So notice that the thrust to weight ratio on my top stage is 1.19. I like to keep this at the very minimum of around 0.9. That ensures that I still do have enough thrust not to get myself into trouble while I do that final part of my orbital insertion. And to make sure that this thrust is for the final part of my orbital insertion, I like to keep the delta V of my upper stage at about 1,000 meters per second. So for your upper stage or your booster, if you want to build a really nice efficient booster, have that upper stage about 1,000, maybe a little more than 1,000 meters per second, and a thrust to weight ratio at a minimum of 0.9, but don't let it get much higher than that, because then what ends up happening is you have an engine that's too big and then too heavy than what you need. Notice the thrust to weight ratios for these lower stages are very similar to what we had before, because these lower stages are working in the lower part of the atmosphere where I do need that thrust to get that velocity going and to get that apoapsis out ahead of me. And if we take a look down here, because I want to compare the two, the total delta V of this guy is 4,974 meters per second. So let's launch this one and see how they compare. And by no means does this video represent the end of this. I just wanted to introduce the idea of how thrust and booster design does affect the efficiencies of your launches. And I'm sure there are people watching this video right now go, but I like to do this and it works great. Please let me know. Leave those comments down there in the description. The more people play this game, the more they start to develop their own sort of sense of what works well for them, because we all have differences in how we design and fly these things. For me personally, it's not always about efficiency. Sometimes I'll sacrifice efficiencies for aesthetics. Noticing this could fall over a little bit more quickly than that. I could have knocked it over quicker at the beginning, but again, try to minimize all of that farting about that you do. If you don't get the ideal trajectory, don't sweat it. When I'm coming close to a staging event, I'm also looking at my time to apoapsis. I'm going to start reducing throttle here already. Lose that stage. Let Separatrons do their work. Reduce throttle more, because I'm getting close to a minute. And with this launch, I just continue to use the exact same profile that I used with the last launch, continually reducing that thrust to keep the time to apoapsis below a minute. And while we watch me doing that, why don't we take this opportunity to welcome aboard my newest patron, Amaranthus. Thank you very much, Amaranthus. It is the support of patrons like you that continue to ensure that new videos keep coming out on a regular basis. Look at that periapsis climb. It is getting close to being out of the negatives. Again, that's the whole idea, is that I'm not just increasing my altitude, I'm also doing the better part of my orbital insertion all at the same time. There we go, 80 by 82. I overdid it again just a little bit. But if we take a look at our delta V, we have left over 1,578 meters per second. That means that that insertion only cost us 3,396 meters per second. Quite a bit less than the 3,600 meters per second we've been budgeting up until now. And with our moon mission now in orbit, let's just quickly summarize these new ideas. first, do your ascent as you've been doing it in the past, but as that time to apoapsis starts to increase, begin reducing your thrust to keep the time to apoapsis between about 45 and 60 seconds. This means that you don't need as much thrust in your upper stages. So have an upper stage where the thrust to rate ratio is only in around the 0.9 range. And to ensure that this is for just the upper stage of your ascent, it just needs to have a delta V of about 1,000 meters per second. This will allow you to put up larger payloads with smaller engines. So now we need to send this thing off to the moon, and don't forget this isn't the only thing on its way onto the moon. I also have our Apollo 12 that's going to carry our crew for this new station, and all of this is going to have to rendezvous with that defunct lander that we left in lunar orbit. And not only that, we also have a Kerbal or two to rescue. It's going to be a rendezvous palooza. That's all going to be for next episode, and I hope to see you then.